The question hanging in the air wasn't just what he did, but why. How does a teenager become so full of hate, so empty of humanity? That image of the smirking boy in the killer shirt becomes a symbol of remorseless evil. But to understand the monster in that courtroom, you have to understand the story that came before. To get the whole picture, we have to go back to the beginning, to a place that believed it was safe.
Blood on the grass won't wash away undetected footprints.
On March 19th, 2013, a packed courtroom in Geauga County, Ohio, was completely silent. The families of the dead and wounded waited, holding their breath for any sign of regret, anything that might help them understand the violence that had stolen their children. Instead, the convicted killer, 17-year-old TJ Lane, unbuttoned his blue dress shirt. Underneath, in black marker on a plain white t-shirt, was a single word: killer. He smirked at them, a chilling, empty smile that held zero remorse. As the families poured out their grief, he just listened, looking almost amused. When it was his turn to speak, he leaned into the microphone and delivered a short, hate-filled rant, ending it by giving the middle finger to the parents of the boys he'd murdered. It was a performance of pure evil, a moment of defiance that shocked everyone who saw it. The question hanging in the air wasn't just what he did, but why. How does a teenager become so full of hate, so empty of humanity? That image of the smirking boy in the killer shirt becomes a symbol of remorseless evil. But to understand the monster in that courtroom, you have to understand the story that came before. To get the whole picture, we have to go back to the beginning, to a place that believed it was safe. Chardon, Ohio, is the kind of place that defines the American heartland. It's a small town known for its maple syrup festival, an historic town square, and quiet tree-lined streets. It's a real community, a place where people know their neighbors. Friday night football is a huge deal, and the safety of kids is taken for granted. Chardon High School was the centerpiece of it all, a red brick symbol of promise and opportunity. In February of 2012, life in Chardon was moving along like it always had. The winter snow was just part of the scenery, and the school week had a comforting rhythm. It was a town that, like so many others, saw stories of school violence on the news and felt sympathy, but also a sense of security. Those were tragedies that had happened somewhere else, in bigger cities, in different worlds, not here. The idea that a student would walk into Chardon High with a loaded gun was just unthinkable. The school cafeteria, a place for morning chatter, gossip, and breakfast before the first bell, was supposed to be a sanctuary, not a war zone. But the illusion of safety is a fragile thing, and in Chardon, that illusion was about to be shattered, proving that no community is immune to the darkness that can hide just beneath the surface. The horror that was coming wasn't just an attack on a school, it was an assault on the very idea of Chardon itself. Before they were names in the headline, they were just boys, sons, brothers, friends, each with a future ahead of them. Daniel Parmerter, 16, was the quiet one. He wanted to be a computer technician, and I was already taking classes at a career school to get a head start. His family described him as a bright young man who was finding his way and was excited about the future. He was at school that morning waiting for the bus to his vocational classes, just a normal part of his daily routine. Demetrius Hewlin, also 16, was known for his infectious smile and his love of life. He was a good student who enjoyed working out. Friends remembered him as upbeat, always trying to make people laugh. His family, who had adopted him, spoke of the joy he brought into their home. Russell King Jr., at 17, was the oldest. He was outgoing and well liked, a vibrant person just starting to figure out life after high school. Like Daniel, he was a student at the Auburn Career Center, studying alternative energy. He was known for being kind and easygoing. These three boys were sitting together in the cafeteria that morning, a simple, ordinary moment before the school day began. At that same table and nearby were three other students whose lives were about to be changed forever. Nick Walzak, who was 17, was a junior known for his sense of humor. That morning, he'd asked his mom if he could stay home from school. She said no. Tell him he had to go, a memory that would haunt her later. Nick was about to face an ordeal that would leave him paralyzed, his life split into a before and an after. Nate Mueller, 17, was sitting with his friends. He would survive, but not without scars. A grave wound to his ear, and the deep, invisible trauma of seeing the unthinkable. And Joy Rickers, 18, was also wounded in the chaos, another young life caught in the crossfire. These weren't statistics. There were 6 teenagers, each with a story, a family, and a future. And on February 27th, 2012, their lives would all collide in a single moment of targeted, inexplicable violence. Thomas Michael Lane, known as TJ, wasn't a student at Chardon High. He was 17 and enrolled at Lake Academy, an alternative school for at-risk youth. He would wait at Chardon in the mornings to catch the bus to get there, but by most accounts, TJ was an outcast who floated on the edges of the high school scene. His background was a mess of instability. Lane came from a broken, violent home. His parents had histories of domestic violence and criminal charges, and TJ hadn't lived with either of them for years. He'd been passed around between relatives before finally landing with his paternal grandparents. That chaotic upbringing left deep scars. Some who knew him described him as a quiet, withdrawn kid who was often bullied. But there was another side to TJ Lane, a darker one that he showed online and in his private writings. In the months before the shootings, he posted a disturbing and rambling poem on his Facebook page. The text was filled with violent fantasies and a sense of deep alienation. It talked about clutching a silver pistol and ending with a chilling line, "Die, all of you." This wasn't just teenage angst, it was a window into a deeply disturbed mind that fantasized about power and death. While some saw a bullied victim, others saw a boy nursing a growing rage. Prosecutors would later argue this wasn't a spontaneous act. The appellate court that reviewed his case would later state definitively that he had planned the attack in advance. He wasn't just a lost soul. He was a hunter, and he had already picked his hunting ground. The boy in the shadows was about to step into the light, armed and ready to unleash the horror he'd been writing about. Monday, February 27th of 2012, started out like any other winter morning. It was cold, and students filed into Chardon High, shaking off the chill. At 7:30 a.m., the cafeteria was buzzing with activity. It was where students gathered before first period, waiting for friends or finishing homework. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation and laughter. It was the sound of a perfectly normal day. Daniel Parmerter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin were sitting at a table. Nick Walzak was with them, along with Nate Mueller. They were just passing the time, waiting for their bus to the Career Center. It was a scene playing out in thousands of schools across America. A group of friends talking and laughing, with no idea that their lives were about to be measured in seconds. At that moment, TJ Lane walked into the cafeteria. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He just walked in, but in his hand he was carrying a .22 caliber Ruger MK3 semi-automatic pistol he had taken from his uncle. He also had a knife. He moved with a chilling purpose, walking directly towards the table where the boys were sitting. There was no argument, no confrontation. There were only the cold execution of a plan. The normal Monday morning sounds of the cafeteria were about to be replaced by gunfire and scream. In less than a minute, the world inside Chardon High was reduced to terror. TJ Lane raised the handgun and opened fire. aiming directly at the table. The first shot hit Daniel Permerter. Lane then methodically fired at the others. He shot Russell King Jr. as he tried to stand up. He shot Demetrius Hewlin. He shot Nick Walzak multiple times. 10 rounds. For a split second, there was confusion. Students heard the pops but didn't immediately realize what they were. Some thought it was a prank, maybe firecrackers, but then came the screams and the sight of their classmates falling. Panic erupted. Students scrambled under tables and ran for the exits, their minds reeling from the horror. In the middle of the chaos, heroes emerged. Frank Hall, an assistant football coach and teacher, was in the cafeteria. He didn't run away from the shots. He ran towards him. He started chasing Lane, who was trying to flee. Hall pursued him down a hallway, yelling at him, trying to stop his rampage. Lane fired at Hall but missed. The coach's brave act likely saved more lives by forcing the shooter out of the building. Another teacher, Joseph Ricci, locked down his classroom and then pulled a wounded student, Nick Walzak, from the hallway into his room. He administered first aid until paramedics could arrive. Outside, 911 calls were flooding the dispatch center. The school went into immediate lockdown. Teachers barricaded doors, huddling with terrified students in dark classrooms. Police and emergency responders descended on the school within minutes, greeted by a scene of absolute carnage. The attack itself was brutally short, but its impact was catastrophic. As Coach Frank Hall chased him from the school, TJ Lane fled into the surrounding neighborhood. The school was now a scene of police cordons and panicked parents, but the shooter was gone. The investigation, though, was moving at lightning speed. Within minutes, police had a suspect. Multiple eyewitnesses from the cafeteria identified TJ Lane, Nate Mueller, who had been at the table, knew Lane and named him immediately. This wasn't a mystery. School surveillance cameras had captured the entire horrific event, providing undeniable proof. A bulletin went out with Lane's name and description. Police quickly found his car parked about a half a mile from the school and set up a perimeter. It didn't take long. Less than an hour after the first shots were fired, officers spotted Lane walking nearby. He was arrested without a struggle, still in possession of the handgun and a knife. The manhunt was over. Back at the school, the grim reality was setting in. Daniel Permeter and Demetrius Hewlin died from their injuries at the hospital. Russell King Jr. was declared brain dead and passed away the next day. Nick Walzak was flown to a trauma center with catastrophic injuries. The community held its breath, praying for the survivors while grieving the dead. The shooter was in custody, but the biggest question remained: why? The immediate horror was over, but the long, painful process of justice wasn't just beginning. The story would now move from the chaos of the crime scene to the cold rooms of an interrogation, and finally a courtroom that would stage one of the most shocking displays of remorselessness ever seen. If you believe these stories are important to tell and that we have to understand them to help prevent future tragedies, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support allows me to keep telling these important stories. In custody, investigators questioned TJ Lane. They have already had a solid case: surveillance video, eyewitnesses, and the murder weapon. What they didn't have was a motive. When they asked him why he did it, Lane's answers were baffling. He claimed he didn't know the victims, and he had picked them at random. He told investigators he just didn't know why he'd done it. But that claim of a random attack was immediately questioned. Several students told reporters that Lane and one of the victims, Russell King Jr., had a personal rivalry, possibly over a girl. One of the survivors, Nate Mueller, was reported dating Lane's ex-girlfriend. This fueled the theory that the attack wasn't random at all, but a targeted act of revenge. TJ wasn't a Chardon student, but he knew the people he shot. The evidence for a planned attack was overwhelming. He didn't just happen to have a gun. He brought a pistol and a knife with him. The appellate court would later write in its ruling that the attack was not impulsive, stating that he planned this attack before he went to school that day with a loaded gun. So which is it? A random act from a disturbed mind or a personal vendetta? The truth is likely a messy combination of both. Lane may have held a grudge against one or more people at that table, which served as a spark, but his own writings and later psychological evaluations revealed a mind already primed for violence. The personal rivalry may have given him a target, but the intent to kill was something he had been cultivating for a long time. That's why it wasn't a simple answer, but a toxic mix of alleged bullying, personal animosity, mental disturbance, and a cold, calculated plan to commit murder. As the legal process began, the central question became T.J. Lane's mental state. To stand trial, a defendant has to be competent, meaning they understand the charges and can help in their own defense. In May of 2012, a competency hearing was held. An expert who evaluated Lane testified that he suffered from a range of severe mental health issues, including psychosis, hallucinations, and violent fantasies. This diagnosis painted a picture of a teenager who wasn't just angry but potentially detached from reality. However, in the eyes of the law, having a mental illness isn't the same as being legally incompetent. The court ultimately ruled that despite his psychological problems, T.J. Lane was competent to stand trial. The judge decided he understood the legal proceedings and was capable of participating in his defense. Soon after, prosecutors made another critical decision. T.J. Lane, though 17 at the time of the shooting, would be tried as an adult, given the severity of the crimes: aggravated murder, attempted murder, and felonious assault. The law allowed his case to be moved to adult court. This meant he would face adult penalties, including life in prison. Because he was a minor, the death penalty wasn't on the table. The stage was now set for a trial that would force everyone to confront the disturbed mind of the boy who committed the crime. With T.J. Lane set to be tried as an adult, the community braced for a long and painful trial. The prosecution's case was ironclad. They had Lane on video, dozens of eyewitnesses, a confession, and the weapons. A trial would have meant forcing the survivors and the victims' families to relive the trauma in graphic detail on the witness stand. But that trial never happened. On February 26, 2013, almost 1 year to the day after the shooting, T.J. Lane changed his plea. He pled guilty to all charges: 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and 1 count of felonious assault. By pleading guilty, Lane waived his right to a trial and gave up most of his grounds for an appeal. It was a sudden end to the question of his guilt. But it wasn't the end of the story. The guilty plea led directly to sentencing. This would be the last time T.J. Lane would appear in court for his crime. It would be the last chance for the families to confront him, and his last chance to speak. No one could have predicted that this final hearing would become the most infamous part of the entire case. The moment when T.J. Lane would finally show the world the monster he had become. The sentencing hearing on March 19th of 2013 was supposed to bring some closure. Instead, it turned to a spectacle of pure evil, orchestrated by Lane himself. He walked into the courtroom with a smirk, wearing a light blue button-down shirt. When it was time for the families to speak, he calmly unbuttoned it, revealing the white t-shirt underneath with "Killer" scrawled across his chest. As the families of the boys he murdered stood before him, their voices breaking with pain, Lane's smirk never left his face. Dina Parmerter, Daniel's mother, looked right at him and said through her tears, "I want him to suffer the rest of his life, the way I suffered the rest of my life without Danny." The other families echoed her pain, talking about the empty chairs at their dinner tables and their unending grief. Then it was Lane's turn. He was given a chance to show remorse, to explain, to say anything. He stood up, leaned into the microphone, and what came out was a stream of vile hatred. In a short, prepared statement, he looked at the grieving families. "This hand that pulled the trigger that killed your sons," he began, "now masturbates to the memory of this F all of you." As gasps filled the courtroom, he raised his cuffed hands and gave everyone the middle finger. It was a final, profane act of defiance, calculated to inflict the most pain possible. Judge David, visibly stunned, called it a disgusting tirade and noted his total lack of remorse. The unmasking was complete. The quiet bully boy was gone, replaced by a sneering monster who revealed in the suffering he'd caused this was the true face of T.J. Lane. The judge's sentence was swift. T.J. Lane was given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 37 years. It was the maximum sentence possible. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. His lawyers later filed an appeal raising multiple issues. including the argument that a life without parole sentence for a minor was cruel and unusual punishment. The appeal was forcefully denied. The court noted the planned and deliberate nature of the attack and the indescribable pain he had inflicted. The Ohio Supreme Court later refused to hear the case, ending his appeals. Lane's time in prison has been anything but quiet. He's been cited for disruptive behavior, including giving himself a tattoo. In September of 2014, he escaped from the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution, a multi-security facility in Lima, Ohio, along with 2 other inmates, sparking a massive manhunt. He was recaptured just hours later, found hiding nearby. After his escape, he was moved to Ohio's Supermax prison. According to the Ohio Department of Corrections records, he is currently incarcerated at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. For these survivors, the journey has been long. Nick Walczak was left paralyzed from the chest down, confined to a wheelchair. In the years since, he has faced his new reality with incredible courage. His humor and strength have been an inspiration, but as he once wrote in response to the critics of a lawsuit he filed, "Walk in my shoes. Oh wait, you can't." The Chardon community remains forever marked by the tragedy. The phrase, "Chardon strong," became a rallying cry for resilience, but the scars run deep. The shooting prompted reviews of school safety protocols across the country. One more tragedy on a long list that forces us to ask if our children are ever truly safe. The story of the Chardon school shooting is above all a story of profound loss. The story of Daniel Parmerter, Demetrius Hewlin, and Russell King Jr., 3 young men whose lives were wiped out in a senseless act of violence. Their futures, their dreams, and all the moments they should have had were stolen in less than a minute. It's also the story of Nick Walczak, Nate Mueller, and Joy Rickers, whose lives were forever altered. Their resilience in the face of such horror is a powerful testament to the human spirit. And eventually it's the story of T.J. Lane, a boy who became a monster. His name is now a synonym for remorselessness, his courtroom performance a chilling portrait of evil. But to focus only on him is to risk forgetting what's most important. We have to remember the victims, not as footnotes in a killer's story, but as bright, promising young people they were. We owe it to them to never forget the morning their futures were stolen, and to keep asking the hard questions that might one day prevent another town from enduring the same horror.
Blood on the grass won't wash away